Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. West Hollywood, California, October 30th, 1982. Dominique Dunn, a 22-year-old actress best known for her role in Poltergeist, was inside her small home on Rangeley Avenue. She was rehearsing dialogue for an upcoming television part. Within minutes, what should have been an ordinary night of preparation would turn into the center of a crime that still resonates today. A quiet residential street would be disrupted by the sound of a struggle, a frantic call for help, and the beginning of a case that left Hollywood stunned. Dominique had built momentum in her career. Coming from a family of writers and entertainers, she was carving her own path in Los Angeles. Friends described her as professional, disciplined, and eager to prove that her success was more than luck. That evening, she invited a fellow actor, David Packer, to her home to run through lines. It was routine for young actors living close to studios, chasing roles and keeping their skills sharp. Packer later told investigators that the rehearsal was calm until just after 8:30 p.m. when a knock at the door interrupted them. Dominique stepped outside, leaving him inside with his script. What happened next unfolded quickly. Raised voices, fragments of argument, then a sudden silence. Packer admitted he was unnerved. When he heard a thud followed by continued disturbance, he picked up the phone and dialed 911. His call was logged within minutes of the incident beginning. Police dispatchers in Los Angeles County received the report of a possible assault in progress at the Rangeley Avenue address. The call taker noted urgency in the caller's voice. Units were dispatched. The log shows that officers were en route by 8:42 p.m. Within 10 minutes, the first patrol car pulled onto the street. The scene they encountered was narrow in scope but telling. Dominique was found collapsed near the driveway area, unresponsive but still with faint signs of life. Paramedics were summoned, arriving almost immediately after patrol. Officers noted no forced entry to the residence, no ransacked rooms, no burglary indicators. This was not a break-in. This was not random. The violence had occurred right at the threshold of her home. Responders began resuscitation measures before transporting her to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She never regained consciousness. At the time of transport, her condition was recorded as critical. The early chain of evidence was simple yet stark. Preliminary notes from the first officer. Manual strangulation suspected. Female victim transported critical. Negative evidence stood out. No weapon present, no signs of robbery, no attempt to flee the scene. Witness testimony from Packer provided the core of the initial narrative. A sudden confrontation, a noise consistent with a struggle, and a victim left unconscious. Investigators preserved the driveway, porch, and immediate walkway as the primary locus. Photographs were taken. Statement forms collected from neighbors who heard raised voices, though few saw the struggle directly. Geographically, the case was compact. From Rangeley Avenue to Cedars-Sinai was a short, direct route, less than 4 miles. The scene, the transport, and the hospital became the triad of locations that defined the first critical hours. This geography would never expand. All primary evidence would anchor to this one residential street and the medical facility where Dominique fought for her life. For investigators, the first chapter of this case was already clear in outline. A young actress, attacked within feet of her front door, a timeline documented through a 911 call, police dispatch logs, and EMS transfer. A scene with no forced entry, no burglary, no chance element. Evidence of manual strangulation requiring direct physical contact. Within hours, the incident was classified not as a domestic dispute but as a violent crime with lethal consequences. The first patrol officers secured the perimeter of Rangeley Avenue almost immediately after paramedics left with Dominique Dunn. The residence itself was modest, a single-story home that fit in with the quiet profile of the neighborhood. What they found outside would set the tone for the rest of the case. From the porch steps down to the driveway, the ground was undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, no broken locks, no shattered glass, no pry marks on the doors. Investigators marked this absence carefully. In homicide investigations, what is not present is sometimes as valuable as what is. Negative evidence becomes part of the pattern. This was not the work of a burglar, nor an intruder from outside. The violence occurred in plain sight, at the boundary of the home, and involved no effort to penetrate the property beyond that point. Police photographers documented the porch, walkway, and immediate exterior with precision. Each angle captured the positioning of a knocked-over garden pot, scuff marks near the lower step, and a faint impression in the gravel by the driveway where Dominique had collapsed. Forensically, these impressions were consistent with a sudden takedown or forced restraint. The impressions were shallow, yet they confirmed there had been a struggle at ground level. No weapon was recovered. That detail mattered. Strangulation cases leave behind very little physical residue. The friend who had been inside, David Packer, gave his statement again at the curb. He described hearing raised voices outside and a struggle that grew intense before silence followed. His words matched the timeline preserved in the dispatch log. 911 had captured his anxiety, and now his live statement provided a human frame to the sterile call records. His testimony would later become a cornerstone. His presence gave prosecutors a credible eyewitness account of sound and sequence, even if he did not directly see the physical assault. Officers canvassed neighbors within minutes. Several reported hearing shouting. One described a female voice that suddenly went quiet. Another recalled what he thought was a loud impact, like a body hitting the ground. None reported seeing weapons. None reported seeing a stranger fleeing the area. This consistency reinforced the negative evidence. No one saw a forced entry. No one saw an outsider. As investigators extended the perimeter, they took note of the residence's locked windows. The interior was calm. Dishes were in the sink, scripts on the living room table, no signs of theft or search. Inside the home, life had been ordinary, interrupted only when Dominique stepped onto the porch. That detail reinforced the central anomaly. She had not been taken from the street, nor attacked inside by a hidden intruder. She had been intercepted right at her own doorway. The medical team at Cedars-Sinai would soon confirm preliminary suspicions. Manual strangulation leaves telltale signs, petechiae in the eyes, bruising around the neck, and damage to the airway. Dominique displayed these consistent injuries. Strangulation requires direct, prolonged physical contact. That forensic truth made the absence of any weapon more significant. Whoever attacked her had done so with bare hands. In homicide casework, strangulation is considered high risk for lethality. It signals intent and persistence because it takes sustained pressure for several minutes to render a victim unconscious. That fact alone framed this case not as an accident, but as deliberate violence. For investigators, the absence of a weapon combined with the physical findings would later prove decisive in shaping how prosecutors built their theory of the crime. The initial crime scene report logged 3 central findings. The victim was located collapsed outside, consistent with a struggle near the threshold. No signs of forced entry or burglary were detected inside or outside the property. Evidence consistent with manual strangulation was observed by medical personnel. For a case this stark, the simplicity of the scene told investigators as much as any complex forensic pattern might. There was no broad canvas of evidence to process, no blood trail, no discarded weapon, no vehicle fleeing the street. Everything began and ended within a space of several feet. Sometimes in forensic work, the cleanest scenes are the hardest because they provide only the outline of what happened. As one detective noted later, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. From this moment forward, the case turned to building a timeline that matched the physical findings with the human accounts. Dominique's life had been cut short within steps of her own door. The struggle lasted only minutes, but those minutes were enough to change her story from that of an actress preparing for her next role to that of a victim in one of Hollywood's most controversial cases. Dominique Dunne was not only a young actress with a promising career, she was also a daughter, a sister, and a friend who had been fighting to reclaim control of her life. By October of 1982, she had already proven her ability on screen, most notably in Poltergeist, which had been released earlier that same year. But behind the public face of a Hollywood success story, Dominique had been navigating a personal relationship that had turned volatile. Investigators, as part of their victimology assessment, looked back at her life in the weeks leading up to October 30th. Friends and family later provided accounts that showed Dominique had been trying to separate herself from a former partner. This separation had not been clean. It came with arguments, repeated attempts by him to re-enter her daily life, and incidents that were reported to confidants but not always to police. One documented event occurred in late August 1982. According to friends, an argument escalated until Dominique was physically pulled by her hair. It was a disturbing act, but one that did not result in immediate criminal charges. She downplayed it at the time. trying to move on. Another incident followed in late September, and this one was more serious. She described being manually choked during an altercation. That detail would later prove chilling, as the method of her eventual death aligned with what she had already endured just weeks earlier. From a forensic lens, patterns of escalation are critical. Intimate partner homicides often show a series of red flags: controlling behavior, physical aggression, strangulation attempts, and ultimately lethal violence. When officers and prosecutors reconstructed Dominique's history, these incidents fit the known risk model. Strangulation, in particular, is identified in criminology as one of the strongest predictors of future homicide. And it signals a willingness to exert sustained, direct, and life-threatening control over another person. In Dominique's case, these episodes painted a picture of a young woman trying to step away from danger, while danger kept closing back in. She had reportedly ended the relationship in late September, moving forward with her career and social life. But separation is also one of the highest risk windows for intimate partner violence. Research has consistently shown that the moment of leaving or rejecting a controlling partner is when victims face the most immediate threat. Those who knew Dominique later told investigators she had begun to change her routines. She limited certain contacts, leaned on friends for support, and made clear she wanted independence. Her rehearsals with David Packer on October 30th were part of that forward momentum. She was focusing on work, on building something separate from the past. That night, she was attempting to practice lines for an upcoming appearance on the NBC medical drama Hill Street Blues. From a procedural perspective, victimology served several functions. It allowed investigators to contextualize the scene at Rangeley Avenue. With no sign of forced entry, the most logical suspect pool narrowed to individuals who had access to her voluntarily. It also shaped prosecutorial theory. The act was not random, not opportunistic. It aligned with a pre-existing pattern of escalating violence. Her family's accounts confirmed this trajectory. In statements given after her hospitalization, they told police they had been aware of the struggles but were hopeful Dominique was strong enough to keep distance. In retrospect, the danger had been underestimated, not in its reality, but in its imminence. That is often the nature of these cases. Families see conflict, they see struggle, but the leap to lethal violence seems unthinkable until it happens. The coroner's preliminary findings added weight to the timeline of escalation. Manual strangulation requires sustained force over several minutes. It is not instantaneous, and it leaves specific physical signs. Those findings match the September incident Dominique had described weeks earlier. It demonstrated that what she had once survived had now been repeated in a final, fatal form. For detectives, the linkage was clear. Dominique's death could not be separated from her recent history. Each act of aggression was part of a chain leading to the scene on October 30th. The courtroom would later wrestle with how much of this history could be heard by a jury, but in investigative files, it was all part of the case. There is a broader reflection here. In many American communities, cases like this underline a systemic issue. Reports of strangulation and domestic violence are sometimes minimized until tragedy makes them undeniable. In 1982, awareness of intimate partner homicide patterns was less advanced than it is today. Dominique's case became a stark example of what happens when early warnings go unaddressed. For viewers, it poses an uncomfortable but necessary question. How many victims today are still caught in the same cycle, visible yet unseen? By the early hours following Dominique Dunn's collapse on Rangeley Avenue, investigators began consolidating testimony, call records, and procedural evidence. In 1982, there were no cell site logs or digital metadata as available in later decades. What they had was the immediacy of landline call traces, the recorded dispatch timeline of the 911 call, and the consistency of statements from multiple witnesses within a defined time frame. The Los Angeles Police Department Dispatch Center retained logs that precisely tracked when the 911 call was made from David Packer's phone inside the residence. The sequence showed a call placed within minutes of the struggle beginning. That record corroborated his statement given at the curb and later documented formally. There was no gap, no unexplained delay. Procedurally, this eliminated any question of staging or delayed reporting. In homicide work, the timing of an emergency call often provides investigators with the first hard marker against which to measure subsequent accounts. Testimonial evidence expanded beyond Packer. Neighbors along Rangeley Avenue independently confirmed hearing a female voice cry out, followed by silence. Several recalled a male voice raised in anger, though none could identify words clearly. The point of emphasis for investigators was that no neighbor described hearing or seeing an unfamiliar person in the area. This was critical negative evidence. It reinforced the absence of an outside intruder. At Cedars-Sinai, medical staff documented Dominique's condition. She was comatose upon arrival, her injuries consistent with manual strangulation. Physicians noted bruising around the neck and airway trauma. These observations were recorded in the medical file within hours. Procedurally, this early medical documentation provided investigators with contemporaneous forensic support, not just retrospective opinion. It gave weight to the timeline that Dominique had been rendered unconscious within minutes of the 911 call and had not regained consciousness. Police interviews with friends and associates of Dominique added context. Several reported she had recently ended her relationship with a man who had shown controlling behavior. One friend recalled a phone call days earlier in which Dominique expressed fear about being followed or confronted. Another friend confirmed she had been rehearsing with Packer that evening in order to focus on work and move forward. Each of these accounts created a consistent picture. Dominique had been attempting to separate herself from risk, but the risk reappeared at her home. From a procedural standpoint, testimonial consistency matters. Contradictions weaken a case. Here, the statements aligned. Packer's account of hearing voices and calling 911 matched the dispatch record. Neighbors' recollections of hearing a struggle matched the physical impressions on the gravel. Medical staff's findings matched prior reports of earlier non-fatal assaults described by Dominique to friends. Each piece reinforced the others. Detectives also examined Dominique's telephone records from the weeks before the attack. Landline records showed repeated incoming calls to her residence, some of which she had described to friends as unwanted. Though the records in 1982 did not provide caller ID, the frequency and timing of those calls, often late at night, were noted as circumstantial evidence of ongoing contact attempts. In the absence of digital surveillance, such call logs became a surrogate measure of persistence and potential harassment. Investigators recognize that in strangulation homicides, the challenge is often not proving the mechanism of death, but establishing intent. By linking the dispatch records, medical documentation, and testimonial accounts, they began to build a narrative chain. The confrontation on the porch was not random, not spontaneous. It was the endpoint of a pattern of contact, escalating in intensity, culminating in lethal force. Procedurally, each of these points had to be preserved carefully for future prosecution. Officers ensured chain of custody on all written logs, transcripts of dispatch records, and signed witness statements. Detectives highlighted the importance of early documentation, because once the case entered the courtroom, each piece of testimony would be scrutinized for reliability. The forensic reality of the case, however, left gaps. There were no fingerprints on a weapon because no weapon existed. There were no surveillance cameras on Rangeley Avenue in 1982. There were no cell phones to triangulate location data. What remained were voices, impressions in gravel, and medical records. Sometimes, the absence of high-technology evidence forces investigators back to the fundamentals: human perception, physical consistency, and procedural accuracy. For families of victims, these cases raise a painful truth. Even when patterns of control and escalation are documented, the legal system demands precision. Dominique's friends had seen the warning signs, but their testimony alone could not serve as predictive. Only when the crime occurred did those warnings take on legal weight. It is a gap that communities still struggle with: how to intervene before a fatal act, not after. By the close of this early evidentiary phase, investigators had established three crucial pillars. The dispatch log fixed the timeline, medical files confirmed manual strangulation, and witnesses independently corroborated the sequence of the struggle. Together, they created a foundation that prosecutors could later use to argue intent and responsibility. By the end of October 1982, Los Angeles detectives had assembled a consistent evidentiary framework: testimony from neighbors, a direct witness in David Packer, medical records confirming strangulation, and dispatch logs fixing the timeline within minutes. What remained was the procedural step that often determines the trajectory of a homicide case: the filing decision. Prosecutors had to take the raw data collected from the scene and translate it into a charging theory that would withstand courtroom scrutiny. In homicide prosecutions, the distinction between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter is often drawn not from the physical act itself but from the interpretation of intent. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office faced this exact dilemma. Dominique Dunn's injuries were fatal, the medical evidence was clear, and multiple witnesses described a violent confrontation. Yet prosecutors understood that presenting the crime as premeditated murder would require demonstrating not only that the assailant killed, but that he did so with a calculated plan. Investigators had logged a history of controlling behavior. Friends confirmed Dominique had tried to end her relationship permanently. Police reports indicated a prior incident where she had been physically assaulted months earlier. These were not abstract claims but corroborated accounts that placed the defendant in a pattern of escalation. Still, from a prosecutorial standpoint, defense counsel would argue the confrontation on Rangeley Avenue was impulsive rather than planned. The legal weight of intent rested on how prosecutors chose to interpret the timeline. The autopsy report became central. Though Dominique survived for several days on life support, the forensic pathologist documented brain death due to asphyxia from strangulation. The lack of forced entry and the location of the attack, directly outside her home in view of neighbors, made it difficult to argue the event was hidden or covert. Prosecutors believed these details could support a charge above simple manslaughter. Yet the reality of jury interpretation weighed heavily. In 1982, intimate partner violence was not yet consistently prosecuted under the frameworks we see today. Juries often interpreted such incidents as crimes of passion, diminishing their legal severity. Charging decisions also weighed the testimony of Packer. As the only person inside the house besides Dominique at the time, his credibility was paramount. He had called 911 promptly. His account aligned with neighbor testimony. Still, prosecutors knew defense counsel would attempt to portray him as biased or unreliable. Anticipating this, detectives emphasized chain of custody and consistency in Packer's statements to reduce avenues for impeachment. Another factor was the defendant's history. Colleagues described him as volatile but not previously convicted of violent crimes. Character witnesses could be brought by both sides, creating a contested picture. Prosecutors prepared to counter with documented medical records from Dominique's earlier injuries. These records were classified as preliminary but relevant evidence, supporting a narrative of ongoing assault. The district attorney's office also recognized the public visibility of the case. Dominique Dunn was not only a young woman but an actress recently seen in a popular film. Media outlets were already reporting details, raising community expectations. Prosecutors had to balance legal standards with public accountability. Overcharging could risk acquittal. Undercharging could trigger outrage. The challenge was procedural precision. File a charge sustainable in court while acknowledging the broader implications of a Hollywood crime that drew headlines far beyond West Hollywood. In November, prosecutors filed charges of second-degree murder. The theory, the act was intentional, not accidental, but lacked the premeditation required for first degree. This charging decision immediately became the anchor point for the case. It signaled to the jury that the state recognized intent but could not establish planning beyond a reasonable doubt. Critics later argued this was the pivotal compromise that shaped the trial's outcome. Defense counsel prepared their counter-narrative. They framed the confrontation as emotional, spontaneous, and tragic without malice aforethought. This strategy leaned heavily on societal perceptions at the time, where domestic violence was often mischaracterized as relationship disputes rather than deliberate crimes. To prepare, prosecutors sought to reinforce their charging theory by consolidating evidence into three main categories: testimonial alignment, medical confirmation of strangulation, and a pattern of prior abuse. Procedurally, the case file expanded to include every report, transcript, and record generated from the night of October 30th through Dominique's death on November 4th, 1982. Medical staff signed affidavits to confirm the irreversibility of her injuries. Detectives submitted sworn statements on the absence of forced entry and the lack of alternative suspects. Prosecutors treated these not as narrative points but as structural beams in their case, pieces that would hold against cross-examination. As the charging theory solidified, investigators privately acknowledged a troubling gap: juror perception. Even with evidence lined up, the challenge would be convincing 12 individuals drawn from the community that intimate partner violence warranted the same weight as premeditated acts of stranger homicide. In towns across the country, murders inside the home were often discounted as private matters, though they were no less violent or final. That tension between evidence and cultural bias shadowed the strategy. For Dominique's family, the filing decision was both a relief and a frustration. Relief that the system recognized the act as intentional. Frustration that the charge stopped short of first degree. This duality is common in cases of domestic homicide. Families see the pattern, the escalation, the inevitability, but prosecutors are bound by statutory thresholds and evidentiary burdens. The result is often a charge that feels partial. From a procedural view, Chapter 5 represented a shift. The crime had been documented, evidence secured, testimony gathered. Now the question turned to translation. How does a stack of reports become a courtroom narrative? And what charge best represents both the act and the intent? For Dominique Dunn's case, the answer was second-degree murder, a decision that would set the stage for a trial watched by Hollywood, legal analysts, and families of victims nationwide. By late 1982, the case of Dominique Dunn's death had already captured national attention. The brutality of her final moments, the youth of the victim, and her rising fame as the young actress from Poltergeist made the upcoming trial not just a proceeding for the Los Angeles County courts, but a public test of how the justice system handled intimate partner violence. West Hollywood had been the crime scene. Now the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles became the focal point. The defendant, John Sweeney, was charged with second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that his act was intentional, the culmination of a pattern of control and abuse. The defense countered that the crime was not premeditated but the product of sudden passion, a loss of control rather than a calculated decision. From the very first hearings, it was clear the trial would turn on a fundamental question: intent versus impulse. Jury selection in the summer of 1983 brought the challenges of balancing the notoriety of the case with the legal need for impartiality. Potential jurors had read newspaper accounts, heard neighbors' interviews on local TV, or even driven by Rangeley Avenue after the crime. Lawyers on both sides spent days screening, probing whether opinions had been formed too firmly to allow a fair evaluation of testimony. 12 citizens, finally seated, would carry the responsibility of sifting through conflicting narratives. In opening statements, the prosecution laid out its theory. Sweeney had shown repeated signs of possessiveness and violence toward Dominique. Witnesses would establish that she had attempted to leave the relationship and that October evening he confronted her at her own home. The physical act, his hands around her neck, was presented as deliberate, an extension of earlier threats. Prosecutors promised the jury they would hear from medical experts who would explain how strangulation requires sustained pressure, not a fleeting moment. The defense painted a different picture. They described Sweeney as a man overwhelmed by emotion, blindsided by the breakup, and incapable of forming intent in the heat of confrontation. Their framing hinged on the idea of voluntary manslaughter, that he had acted in passion rather than with malice aforethought. While acknowledging that Dominique had died by his hands, they sought to persuade the jury that his state of mind reduced culpability. Testimony unfolded over several weeks. Neighbors who lived near Rangeley Avenue recounted what they had heard that night. Shouts, the unmistakable sounds of a struggle, and then silence before police arrived. One neighbor remembered calling 911 within minutes, shaken by the suddenness of the disturbance. Their testimony reinforced that the confrontation had been loud and violent, leaving little doubt that force had been applied deliberately. Medical experts were next. Pathologists detailed the mechanics of strangulation, noting the injuries to Dominique's neck and the time it would take to render someone unconscious. The prosecution emphasized that the act was not instantaneous but prolonged, arguing that Sweeney had sufficient time to release her but chose not to. This evidence was critical, underscoring that Dominique's death was the result of sustained pressure, not an accident. Friends and family members also took the stand, offering context to Dominique's final weeks. They spoke of her fear, her attempts to distance herself, and prior incidents of control. These testimonies gave jurors a human portrait of the victim, a 22-year-old actress trying to build independence, struggling against a relationship that had turned volatile. For many in the courtroom, their words shifted the trial from abstract legal arguments to the reality of a young woman's life cut short. The defense countered with character witnesses for Sweeney, co-workers who described him as diligent, professional, and not prone to violence in public settings. They highlighted his consistent employment as a chef and tried to show that his private life with Dominique was an exception, a relationship dynamic gone wrong, rather than evidence of a violent man at his core. The defense attorney hammered at the prosecution's theme of intent, insisting the act was an emotional collapse, not a planned killing. Throughout the proceedings, the jury was instructed to weigh only what was presented in evidence. Yet the public gallery, filled with reporters and members of the film community, created an atmosphere charged with scrutiny. Each day, accounts of the testimony appeared in newspapers across the country. Observers noted the tension between a legal system bound by statutes and a public expecting justice for a life cut short. Closing arguments distilled the trial into its core conflict. Prosecutors urged the jury to recognize that Dominique Dunne had been fighting to escape a dangerous relationship, and that the fatal act was the final expression of Sweeney's control. The defense implored them to see a man who had lost control in a heated moment, deserving of punishment but not a murder conviction. When deliberations began, anticipation outside the courthouse was intense. After days of testimony, the jury now had to interpret not just evidence but intent, a concept difficult to measure yet central to the charge. Hours turned into days as they debated. Some jurors reportedly leaned toward murder, persuaded by the pathologist's testimony about sustained strangulation. Others were more cautious, influenced by the defense argument that the act lacked premeditation. Ultimately, the jury returned a verdict of voluntary manslaughter, along with a conviction for misdemeanor assault. The courtroom reacted with silence, followed by shock from Dominique's family and friends. For many, the reduced charge felt disconnected from the facts of the crime. While the defense had successfully shifted the narrative from murder to manslaughter, the decision sparked immediate controversy. The judge imposed a sentence of 6.5 years with the possibility of parole after serving less than half. For Dominique's parents and siblings, it was an outcome that compounded their loss. Not only was her life taken, but the punishment seemed inadequate to reflect the gravity of the act. Outside the courthouse, public reaction mirrored that of the family. Editorials in major newspapers criticized the verdict, arguing that the justice system had failed to hold Sweeney fully accountable. Forensic and procedural experts later remarked on the trial as a case study in how legal framing can alter outcomes. The physical evidence had been strong, but the interpretation of intent proved decisive. Jurors, bound by instructions and the burden of proof, opted for the lesser charge. It highlighted the complexities of prosecuting intimate partner crimes, where patterns of abuse may not fit neatly into statutory definitions of premeditation. By the end of 1983, the trial was over, but the controversy lingered. Dominique Dunne's death, once a private tragedy on a quiet street, had become a public symbol of how domestic violence intersects with the limitations of the law. For her family, the verdict closed the legal chapter but left unresolved questions about justice. For the public, it was a reminder that not all crimes end with outcomes that match the weight of the evidence. As this chapter concludes, one reality is clear. Dominique Dunne's case became more than a single crime in West Hollywood. It became a touchstone for conversations about domestic violence, the boundaries of legal definitions, and the ongoing struggle to align justice with accountability. The trial may have reached a verdict, but the resonance of the case would echo for decades. When the gavel struck in that Los Angeles courtroom in late 1983, it closed the legal chapter of People v. John Sweeney, but it did not close the public reckoning. The verdict of voluntary manslaughter and the sentence of 6.5 years, with parole possible in less than half that time, sent Dominique Dunne's family, friends, and much of Hollywood into disbelief. For many, it felt as if the system had not just failed to protect Dominique during her life, it had failed again in death. The days following the sentencing were marked by stark contrasts. Inside the Dunne household, grief was compounded by anger. Dominique's parents, Dominic and Ellen, spoke publicly about their daughter not only as a victim of a violent crime, but as a symbol of how lenient outcomes could be in cases of intimate partner homicide. They noted that Dominique had done everything society encourages victims to do. She had tried to leave, had sought independence, had leaned on friends. Yet in the end, none of it had shielded her. Meanwhile, in the broader community, the response was swift. Editorials appeared in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, and regional outlets across the country criticizing the verdict as dangerously soft. Commentators pointed out that the physical evidence of strangulation required sustained force, and that the law's distinction between passion and malice often diminished the lived experiences of victims of domestic violence. In this case, they argued, it had led to a punishment far out of step with the crime. The entertainment industry, where Dominique's career had just begun to rise, responded with visible solidarity. Cast members from Poltergeist and other projects she had touched gave interviews. recalling her promise as an actress and her warmth as a colleague. Television segments played clips from her performances, juxtaposed with courtroom footage of the man who had ended her life. The contrast struck viewers, the vitality of a 22-year-old woman and the legal reality of a reduced conviction. For her father, Dominic Dunne, the aftermath marked a turning point. He would later channel his grief into a career as a crime journalist, chronicling cases of violence, betrayal, and courtroom drama for Vanity Fair. In many of his pieces, readers could trace the imprint of Dominique's case, a determination to expose not only the perpetrators of violent crime, but the system that often seemed to soften their accountability. This transformation, from bereaved father to chronicler of justice and injustice, became one of the most enduring legacies of Dominique's death. In Los Angeles County, legal scholars used the trial as a case study. Law schools dissected the proceedings, asking how the framing of intent versus impulse had so strongly influenced the outcome. Some professors argued that jurors had been left without sufficient tools to weigh the cumulative evidence of prior abuse. Without statutes specifically addressing patterns of domestic violence, prosecutors were forced to argue within the narrower confines of intent. The result, they said, was a verdict that undercut the reality of coercive control, leading to lethal violence. Victim advocacy groups also seized on the case. In 1984 and beyond, they pointed to Dominique's story in campaigns for stronger protections for women attempting to leave abusive relationships. Hotlines, shelters, and outreach programs cited her case as evidence of how dangerous the weeks following a breakup can be. Some even referred to the period after separation as the most lethal window, a recognition born from tragedies like Dominique's. As the years passed, John Sweeney served less than his full sentence. Released after a few years, he attempted to resume life out of the public eye. For the Dunne family, his release reopened wounds, a reminder of what they saw as disproportionate accountability. Journalists tracking his reintegration noted that while he could rebuild, Dominique's life had ended permanently at 22. The asymmetry between consequence and loss became another source of anger for advocates. Public memory of the case did not fade, in part because Hollywood has long been both an industry of storytelling and a community prone to public mourning. Documentaries revisiting cases of celebrity crime included Dominique's, often alongside discussions of how fame does not insulate victims from violence but can amplify the attention their cases receive. In these programs, legal experts continued to describe the outcome as emblematic of a justice system struggling to adapt to the complexities of domestic abuse. Forensic analysts later revisiting the case reaffirmed what had been clear from the start. The medical evidence left no doubt about cause of death. The pathologist's testimony had been decisive, but its impact on the verdict had been diluted by legal framing. Strangulation cases, especially in domestic settings, often suffered this fate. Clear physical evidence undermined by debates over state of mind. Dominique's case became one of the examples cited when advocates pressed for reforms to treat strangulation as a serious felony, regardless of whether death occurred. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dominique Dunne's name appeared in academic works, law review articles, and public lectures. Her story was taught not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point in cultural recognition of domestic violence as a societal problem rather than a private matter. Scholars noted how her case paralleled broader shifts in American law enforcement, from a time when police often hesitated to intervene in domestic disputes to an era of mandatory arrest policies. For viewers and listeners today, more than 4 decades later, Dominique's case resonates because it feels unfinished. The trial reached a verdict, but the sense of justice remains contested. Each retelling of her story brings new audiences into the conversation about how crimes of passion are treated under the law and whether passion should ever mitigate accountability when life is taken. At its heart, Dominique's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Legal definitions and human reality do not always align. A court may weigh malice aforethought in technical terms, but a victim's family experiences only the finality of loss. And in Dominique's case, the gap between those two perspectives became national news. Even now, on quiet streets in West Hollywood, the memory of that October night in 1982 lingers. Residents recall how quickly ordinary sounds, footsteps, conversations, music drifting from open windows were replaced by the chaos of police cars and sirens. It is a reminder that crime does not just occur in dark alleys or abandoned spaces. Sometimes it erupts in the very neighborhoods people associate with safety and comfort. Dominique Dunne's death, and the trial that followed remain part of Los Angeles legal history. But beyond the courtroom, her case reshaped conversations in homes, universities, and legislative halls. Her name became shorthand for the dangers of ignoring warning signs, the consequences of minimizing domestic abuse, and the limits of a legal system still learning how to balance evidence, law, and justice. West Hollywood, California, October 1982. What began as a late-night emergency call from Rangeley Avenue ended as one of Los Angeles's most contested verdicts. Within minutes, Dominique Dunn was transported from her driveway to Cedars-Sinai. Days later, after doctors confirmed brain death, the case shifted from medical effort to homicide investigation. The evidence was consistent and uncontested, no forced entry, witnesses hearing a struggle, medical findings of strangulation. The geography never widened: a single home, a hospital, a courtroom. That clarity left no mystery about what happened. The dispute arose only in how the law defined intent. In court, prosecutors pressed for murder. The defense argued passion, not premeditation. The jury returned voluntary manslaughter. John Sweeney served less than 4 years of a 6.5-year sentence. For the Dunn family, and for the public, the punishment felt out of scale to the crime. Dominique's death became more than a closed file. It galvanized victims' rights advocacy, shaped later reforms on intimate partner violence, and drew attention to the lethality of strangulation. Her case remains in trainings and case law discussions as a turning point. The record does not wander. One young actress, one home, one violent act, one verdict. That precision is what gives the case its enduring weight. Dominique Dunn died by strangulation at her West Hollywood home. John Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and served less than 4 years. The crime endures as a cautionary emblem of intimate partner violence. Looking back on Dominique Dunn's story, I can't help but think about how fragile safety can be when trust is broken. Her case is more than a Hollywood tragedy. It's a reminder that warning signs in relationships should never be ignored. If you've ever felt silenced or overlooked, let this crime show you that speaking up matters and accountability matters. What do you think? Does justice always match the harm done? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this video spoke to you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.